It's time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. Rival parties in South Korea's National Assembly are aiming to reach a compromise by the end of the week on committee leadership posts after weeks of failure to strike up a deal on who's going to lead which committee. Kwon Seong-dong, floor leader of the ruling People Power Party, and his main opposition Democratic Party counterpart Park Hong-keun held talks this Tuesday where they agreed to reach an agreement by Sunday, which would mark Constitution Day, as the delay has been holding up the Assembly for weeks and weeks since its last session ended in late May. However, with huge mistrust and clashes over key committees, namely the Judiciary Committee, it's uncertain that there may be a breakthrough. So we discussed the prospects ahead with Song-se-ryun, Professor of Kyunghee University's Law School, and David Tizard, Professor of Korean Studies at Seoul Women's University. Thank you both so much for joining us. And well, my first question to you, Professor Song. Now, let's begin with the reason that the ruling party and the main opposition party is having this weeks-long rift over who's going to lead which committee. Why is it that they just cannot come to an agreement? And why is the Legislation and Judiciary Committee so significant?
Well, I think it's a power struggle, pure and simple. They're in a stalemate now how to form the committees and which party will take the committee chairmanships, especially the Legislation and Judiciary Committee. And that particular committee, Legislation Judiciary Committee, as the name suggests, yields a big influence in legislative matters as well as judiciary matters, including impeachments. All bills pass through this committee, and the chairman traditionally had a power to block the bill and control the flow of the legislative process. So in effect, this gatekeeper role functions like having a Senate. Korea is a unicameral legislature, but this committee sits above all other committees and, in fact, have a gatekeeper role to control what legislation gets the focus and what passes. So in that sense, it is an important committee. But because of the agreements they had that should have been resolved by now and get to the domestic and international matters that are very urgent in Korea and overseas.
And Professor Tizard, well, the Democratic Party, it's offered to hand over the chief post of the Judiciary Committee in return for the PPP's cooperation in launching a special committee on judiciary reform. But the ruling party has rejected this proposal on a few accounts. So why is this very much unacceptable to them?
Well, I think as Professor Song says, it's not just about control of these various committees, but it's about a broader shift of power. Nobody really expected the Conservative Party in South Korea to be in power at the moment. A couple of years ago, there was talks of decades-long rule of the Democratic Party, and that conservatism in South Korea was dead and buried. And so I think there was a lot of institutionalized practices. There was a lot of transfers of power, not just over the Judiciary Committee, but in terms of the prosecution, in terms of the police, in terms of the unification ministries, in terms of nuclear power. And so, whereas previously the Democratic Party were institutionalizing their own ideas, all of a sudden, rather unexpectedly, we have the Conservative Party in here with mayors of Seoul sweeping victories at the local elections as well as obviously the presidential election. And so now it's about handing over power back to the Conservative Party. So it's about a broader ideological shift in the country. I think what's really important, as Professor Song said, though, that this is taking a long time. There's a lot of give and take. There's a lot of worry about if this power is handed over, what then happens. So the checks and balances are important, but more important than that is that these two parties try to work together for the good of the South Korean people and for the good of the nation going forward, because the infighting doesn't really help anybody.
And well, as you mentioned, it looks like the Democratic Party is still coming to terms with this flip that we've seen in the National Assembly and the presidential election, of course. And well, Professor Song, despite the defeat that the DP faced in the presidential and local elections, the party seems to be very uncompromising at the National Assembly at the moment. So right now, how much leverage do they have in Parliament, and what are the key agendas or issues that they're going to continue to try and force through?
Well, they still have the numbers. They have the 169 seats out of 300, when the Justice Party and other parties that are favorable to the opposition party, they can muster up to over 180 seats, 80 votes. So they certainly have the numbers. But as you said, they lost a string of elections, including the presidential election and the latest one, the local election. So with this trend, they should feel lucky that the next general election is not until October 2024. So what kind of agenda they are pushing at this point, I think they are still trying to come to terms with the defeat. And it seems like their agenda lately seems to be on the ideological side rather than going for the economic and other important issues that people do care about and show up in the polls. So frankly, what is troubling is that we don't see at this point what is the vision of the opposition party. The same can go for the ruling party as well, but it seems to be a total or the kind of worrying failure or dysfunctionality in the political sector as a whole.
So while progress on key issues really affecting people's livelihoods amid this cost of living crisis and also other economic issues lay unaddressed, the Democratic Party in May, they pushed through a series of controversial bills, including one that will strip the prosecution of its investigative powers, despite a lack of bipartisan agreement. So, Professor Tizard, do you think this has really broken trust towards the opposition party at the moment, and also by members, especially with members of the public as well?
It's a very interesting question. In the Democratic Party, they did have that National Assembly majority. They had the ability to fast track through various bills. And this was seen as a good thing at sometimes because it skipped a lot of bureaucracy. It allowed things to get done. But then came the problem when they knew they were going to be losing power. Were they putting through bills that would protect themselves or that would keep things in? You asked if the public are losing trust in the Democratic Party. I think both parties will always have their ardent supporters online. These supporters will be very vocal. They will be quick to counter any criticism of either the Democratic or the Conservative Party, and they will be quick to sing the praises as well. I think Professor Song made a really interesting point in that the parties themselves seem to be rather ideological at the moment in their stances, particularly vis-a-vis each other. However, the public have shown that they're not always ideological. Outside of the core support groups, people vote on pragmatic issues. They vote on the economy, they vote on housing, they vote on taxation, and they vote on what they see. A very big keyword recently has been this idea of hypocrisy, fairness, equality. Neronambul, this idea of romance and hypocrisy, became a huge talking point in South Korea. So I think for the majority of the public, what they want is fairness, they want equality, and they will be willing to shift their votes accordingly if they feel that their trust, their votes are not being adhered to.
And Professor Song, with this tug of war over the legislation and Judiciary Committee especially dragging out for so long, how are key bills and societal issues being affected?
Well, as they are out of the ring at this point, important bills are not debated or made into law, pure and simple. I think this is very unfortunate, as Professor Tizard pointed out. This ruling party going into the power knew that they won a very narrow victory. So the mandate from the people from the election is not that big. So they knew that they had to work together with the opposition party, who has a great majority. And we don't see the evidence of efforts of working together, any sincere effort, after all. So I think that the people's disappointment about the political sector and the two major parties are getting larger and larger. I think that this will signal certain the breaking point at some point because we need the innovation and the some kind of big change in the leadership and the composition and the vision in both parties. I think that point has not come yet, but seems like the Korean politics is going down the spiral where a big change is bound to happen, whether it was pushed by the political sector itself or from the popular opinions.
And Professor Tizard, well, the two floor leaders, they agreed that they would agree, which is something they should have done anyway, but they said that they would try and reach an agreement by Sunday. Do you see any bipartisan cooperation happening or trust between the two camps improving anytime soon?
I think they need to, and there's a symbolic day coming up, as you said at the start of the program. We have Constitution Day coming up in South Korea, and so I think it would be in both parties' interest to demonstrate to the public that they are willing to work together to some degree. Now, let's just consider our position as the public. Politicians, leaders, assemblymen, they ask us as the public to work together on issues of COVID-19, on issues of global warming and climate change, on issues of austerity and inflation. We're frequently asked as members of the public to work together, to get along and to take one for society. I think what these politicians need to do is recognize that they're required to do the same thing sometimes if we want to move forward. There was a really interesting article written by, a column written by Professor La Jong-il, previous ambassador to the United Kingdom. And what he said is that it's really important for these South Korean politicians to acknowledge that they are not enemies. They're co-workers, they're colleagues, and their job is to work together to create a better future for the citizens, because if they don't do that, then it's the citizens ultimately that suffer. So I would hope that going forward, these two entrenched parties, as much as they might have ideological differences, do start to realize that they're on the same team ultimately.
And Professor Song, well, as long as this conflict drags out, key issues are being neglected, taxpayers' money is being wasted. Do you see any chance of a compromise happening anytime soon? What's it going to take to really get to that point?
Well, I think it has to do with the internal matters and also, as Professor Tizard pointed out, learning how to work together. I think that internally, both parties, it seems to be going through some sort of identity crisis. And that has to do with whether they can embrace the young generations and moderates. I thought that the PPP was making a stride when the Lee Jun-suk was going in as a young leader, but they seem to be mired in a power struggle. So that's the whole question itself. But going forward, I think that they have to look at the polls and what people are saying about this country and the role of the Korea in the world. If they don't learn to work together and pass laws and put things into action, I think that the recession that we're looming and all kinds of crises that we have to face as a middle power in the world probably will suffer very, very much. So in that sense, it's not just the internal matter, it's not just the party politics, it is about the future of Korea that they are dealing with. So I think that they should shape up pretty soon.
And on that note, Professor Song, the ruling party, it's been going through quite a rough patch recently following Chairman Lee Jun-suk's suspension over a sexual bribery scandal. Now, the party's decided that it's not going to hold a national convention to elect a new leader, though. So how do you think these party dynamics are going to impact support for the sitting government? And what do you think the PPP's strategy is in handling this crisis?
I don't know if they have the strategy at this point. I think we can point out that the other party, actually, Park Ji-hyun, going through same sort of treatment, I would say, from the party, the establishment. I think there is a crisis in terms of generational change that people feel that has to take place, but people in the power are very, very reluctant to give it up. I think that the big picture has to be that the young generations and young leaders, I'm not just talking about the Lee Jun-suk, but what he represents and what Park Ji-hyun represents. Those new blood and new ideas and new ways of doing things should be a very valuable commodity to come in to both parties going forward. I think the PPP in particular, because they are the ruling party, they have to shape up, and they picked a worst moment to do this because the president's performance at this point is in question at this point. Then the ruling party itself has to supply the stability, but they don't think it is a priority, and that's an unfortunate situation.
And well, when it comes to embracing these generational changes, Professor Tizard, I know you have a lot to say on this, especially with the DP as well. It's been going through its own internal strife. How do you see them? What kind of changes do you think they're going to have to really make?
I think these changes have to be not just cosmetic. So both parties have looked to place young people in prominent positions. Now, are they putting those people there just for political expediency and to show that they're representing the youth, or do they really believe in that? We've seen the struggles of Lee Jun-suk and in the Democratic Party as well. These young leaders, they're not very welcome. They've had their own controversies and scandals, very different in nature, it must be said. But I think it's really important that the youth of this country, they're intelligent, they're forward-thinking, and they want to have a say in the country. It shouldn't just be cosmetic, but it should be genuine. We see in other parts of the world, entrenched political systems sometimes refusing to hand over power, and it becomes this kind of gerontocracy where old people rule, where we have presidents that are in their 80s and 70s. Other parts of the world, look at Finland, look at New Zealand, they've shown that young leaders, not just people in the party, but actually young leaders, bring with them new visions, new ideas. I think that's a possibility for South Korea, but it shouldn't just be cosmetic, it should be genuine. Whether it's capable of doing that is another question in itself, but it is possible, and it's up to South Korea to choose what it would like to do going forward.
Well, hopefully we'll see a major political breakthrough this Sunday, hopefully. But, well, until then, we'll just have to wait and see, I suppose. But this is where we'll have to leave the interview today. That was Hong Tae-yeon, Professor of Kyunghee University Law School, and David Tizard, Professor of Korean Studies at Seoul Women's University. Thank you both so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.